The silent wedding night took a dark turn when the Duke saw what she was hiding. The silent wedding night took a dark turn when the Duke saw the truth she had bled to keep hidden, a map of past violence etched into her very skin. The wedding night began in silence, and that silence felt heavy enough to crush the breath right out of her chest. The rain beat hard against the roof of Berth Manor as Alberta Ruhland sat stiffly at the edge of the velvet chair, her spine straight, her gloved hands folded tight in her lap. Her wedding dress was made of soft ivory cotton and fine lace, but tonight it felt like a rope tied around her body. Every stitch felt like a rule. Every pearl felt like a weight. She kept her eyes away from the mirror because she already knew what she would see. The same face she had worn for 7 long years. Calm on the outside, hiding everything underneath. Somewhere in the dimly lit room waited Duke Charle Berth, a man she barely knew, a man whose eyes she feared more than anything else in that moment. Not because he looked cruel, but because he looked like a man who saw things clearly. And there were things on her body she had spent 7 years making sure no one ever saw clearly. She pulled her gloves tighter and did not turn around. Before we get deep into the story, please let me know in the comments where you are watching from. Hit subscribe if you are hooked in and ready to enjoy the story, because tomorrow I have another beautiful story to share with you and I don't want you to miss it for anything. Now let's get into the story. The carriage that carried Alberta to Berth Manor smelled of wet leather and old wood, and she kept her eyes fixed on the dark road ahead rather than on the village of Ashford dissolving into rain behind her. She had not chosen this journey. She had not chosen anything in 7 years. Since the day her parents died and left her in Cedric Ruhland's care, every decision of her life had been made for her the way a farmer decides which field to plant and which to let rot. Cedric had managed her inheritance with quiet efficiency. He had managed her movements, her words, her appearances at social gatherings, the precise angle of her smile when respectable men came to dinner. And now he had managed this. A marriage arranged in his parlor on a Tuesday afternoon while she stood near the door and was not offered a seat. A suitable match, he had said. The Duke needs a quiet bride. You will show him gratitude. She had nodded. She had learned that nodding was faster than speaking and cost her considerably less. The carriage lurched over a rut in the road and pain shot up her back, sharp and familiar, and she pressed her lips together and waited for it to pass. It always passed. That was the one thing she had come to count on about pain. It moved through her and left her still standing, the same way everything else had. Through the fogged window she caught her first real sight of Berth Manor. It rose out of the storm like something that had always been there and had simply been waiting for the darkness to make it visible. Stone walls. Tall windows glowing amber from within. Iron gates standing open at the end of the long gravel drive, wide enough to swallow a carriage whole without slowing down. Wide enough, she thought, to swallow a woman without anyone noticing. She had heard people speak of Duke Charle Berth the way they spoke of weather. Powerful. Inevitable. Not unkind exactly, but not the sort of man whose moods you ignored without consequence. He had built his fortune from land and trade and the particular kind of patience that accumulates wealth quietly over decades. He had never married. No one seemed to know precisely why. Cedric had called it good fortune that a man like that would consider her at all. She had said nothing. The carriage rolled to a stop before the front steps. A footman opened the door and held out his hand, and Alberta took it and stepped down into the rain, and for one brief moment she stood in the open air between the carriage and the door, with the storm coming down around her and the cold hitting her bare shoulders above the lace neckline, and she thought, "This is the last moment I belong only to myself." Then she walked through the door, and the silence of the house closed around her like a hand. She heard him move before she saw him. A single step across the wooden floor, then stillness. The kind of stillness that meant he had seen something and was deciding carefully what to do with it. Alberta's hand was still raised halfway to her shoulder where the lace had slipped. She could feel the cool air of the room against the exposed skin of her upper back. She could feel exactly how much of the scar was visible without needing to look. She had memorized the geography of it years ago. The highest edge began just below the left shoulder blade. That was what he could see right now. That was what had stopped him. She lowered her hand slowly and straightened her spine and prepared the words she had practiced for this moment. Words she had built carefully over years, the way a person builds a wall, one ordinary stone at a time. "A fall," she would say. "When I was young. The stone steps at my cousin's estate. It healed badly. I should have told you before the wedding, and I apologize for that." She would say it plainly, without flinching, the way a person recounts something unfortunate but unremarkable. She would watch his face change, and she would keep her own face very still, and she would wait to see what kind of man she had married. Albert. His voice was quiet. Not soft exactly, but careful. The way a man speaks in a room where something fragile is balancing on an edge. She turned around. Duke Charle Berth stood a few feet away, still fully dressed, his dark coat unbuttoned at the collar, a single candle burning on the table beside him. He was looking at her with an expression she had not prepared herself for. Not disgust. Not the cold withdrawal she had rehearsed against. Not pity either, which she would have found almost as difficult to bear. He looked like a man who recognized something. "You don't have to explain it," he said. She opened her mouth. The practiced words were right there, arranged and ready. A fall. The stone steps. It healed badly. She had said them so many times inside her own head that they felt like the truth. "I was going to say it was a fall," she said instead. Something shifted in his face. Not surprise. More like confirmation of something he had already suspected. He crossed the room to the armchair near the fireplace and lifted the heavy wool robe that had been draped across it. He walked back toward her and held it out, not moving closer than arm's length, not reaching for her, simply offering it the way you offer something to a person you want to give a choice to. "Put this on," he said, "and then sit down. We don't have to talk tonight if you don't want to, but I would like you to know that you are safe here." She looked at the robe, then at his face. She took it. She did not plan to tell him. She had sat down in the chair nearest the fire with the wool robe pulled close around her shoulders and told herself she would say nothing beyond what was necessary. A polite exchange. A few careful sentences. Then sleep and morning and the business of learning how to exist inside this new life without giving too much of the old one away. But the fire was warm. And the room was quiet in a way that Cedric's house had never been quiet. And Duke Charle Berth sat across from her in the opposite chair with his elbows on his knees and his eyes on the floor, not watching her, not pressing her, simply present in the way that certain people are present when they have decided that patience is the most important thing they can offer. And something inside her, some tightly wound mechanism that had been holding for 7 years, shifted without her permission. It wasn't a fall, she said. He did not look up immediately. When he did, his expression had not changed. He was still just listening. The steps were behind Cedric's house, she continued. Stone. 14 of them. I had been speaking to one of the farmhands near the gate. Nothing improper. A word about the weather, nothing more than that. She paused. Her hands were still in her lap, very still. Cedric saw from the upper window. By the time I turned around, he was already at the top of the steps. She could still see it. The pale afternoon light. The way his face looked when the rage had fully taken hold of it, emptied of everything except the need to make her understand that she belonged to him completely. He said I had embarrassed him. I tried to explain. He didn't want an explanation. She kept her voice level. She had learned a long time ago that if she kept her voice level, the memories lost some of their power over her. Not all of it, but some. He pushed me. I caught the edge of the first step with my shoulder. Then the second. Then I stopped counting. The fire shifted. A log settling deeper into the heat. The doctor came the next morning. Cedric told him I had lost my footing. The doctor wrote it down exactly as Cedric said it. She looked at her gloved hands. Everyone believed him. He was a respected man. And I had no one. Charle had not moved. But his jaw had tightened in a way that was not anger at her. She understood the difference. She had spent years learning to read the anger in men's faces, and this was not directed at her. It was directed at something else entirely. How old were you? He asked. 19, she said. The words sat between them in the firelit room like something that had needed to be put down for a very long time. He nodded once, slowly. You have someone now, he said quietly. She had not expected him to speak after that. Men like Charle Berth, in her experience, responded to difficult truths with silence or redirection. A change of subject. A practical observation that closed the door on whatever had just been opened. She had expected him to stand, perhaps, and say something measured about rest and the lateness of the hour. Something that acknowledged what she had told him without requiring him to step any closer to it. Instead, he leaned back in his chair and looked at the fire for a long moment, and then he said, "My father was a hard man." She watched him. Not in the way people mean when they say it as a compliment. The corner of his mouth moved, but it was not a smile. They used to say it about him in the village. Hard man. Built something from nothing. Didn't suffer weakness. They meant it as praise. He turned the ring on his right hand slowly, once, a habit she suspected he was not aware of. Inside the house it looked different. He did not elaborate immediately. He seemed to be choosing his words the way a person chooses their footing crossing a damaged bridge, testing each one before trusting it with weight. He believed that fear was the only language that produced results, Charle said. That if a person was not afraid of you, they had no real reason to respect you. He applied that belief consistently. A pause. To the estate workers. To my mother. To me. The fire breathed between them. Alberta did not speak. She understood instinctively that what he needed right now was the same thing she had needed 20 minutes ago. Not questions. Not reassurance. Simply someone willing to remain in the room while the words came out. I have my own map, he said quietly. Mine are older. less visible. He glanced up at her briefly. But I know what it costs a person to carry that kind of history in their body. The way it changes how you move through a room. The way you learn to watch a person's hands before you watch their face. She felt something move through her chest at that. A recognition so precise it almost hurt. She had been watching his hands all evening without realizing she was doing it. When I was old enough I left, he said. I built everything you see here as far from that house as I could get it. But I made myself a promise when I took ownership of this estate. He looked at her steadily. That fear would never be spoken here. Not as a tool. Not as a language. Not in any form. He said it simply, without drama, the way a man states something that has long since stopped being a decision and become simply the truth of who he is. Alberta looked at him across the firelit room. For the first time since the carriage, she felt her shoulders drop. She slept that night for the first time in years without waking before dawn. No sound of footsteps in the corridor outside her door. No lying still with every muscle tensed, waiting to understand whether what she had heard was real or imagined. Just the rain tapering off sometime before morning and the warmth of the room and a stillness that asked nothing of her. When she woke the bed was cool on the other side and Charle was gone. A maid brought water and a simple breakfast and told her the Duke had risen early. Alberta dressed slowly and told herself that one quiet night did not mean anything yet, that she should not allow herself to read too much into kindness that was still new enough to be performance. She was in the hallway outside the library when she heard his voice. Not raised. Charle's voice never raised. She was already learning that. But there was something in the register of it, a controlled tightness she had not heard from him before, that made her stop walking. The library door was open 2 inches. She stood to the side of it and did not move. When did these arrive? He said. A pause. Someone else's voice, lower, she could not make out the words. Then Charle again. He sent them before the wedding. Another pause. Longer. Leave me. She heard footsteps cross the room and she stepped back from the door and moved to the window at the end of the hall and stood looking out at the wet grounds until the library fell silent again. Then she walked back and knocked once on the open door and pushed it wider. Charle was standing at his desk. In his hand was a document, several pages folded together, the kind of official correspondence that carried the weight of legal language in every line. His face was composed, but his knuckles around the papers were white. He looked up when she entered and something moved through his expression. A decision being made very quickly about how much to say and how to say it. Sit down, Alberta. She sat. She had learned to read rooms well enough to know this was not the moment to ask questions. She waited. He set the papers on the desk between them and smoothed them flat with one hand. These are documents Cedric prepared and submitted to a physician in the city before our wedding, he said. They describe a pattern of erratic behavior, emotional instability, and detachment from reality. He looked at her directly. They are a formal petition to have you committed to Harwick Asylum on grounds of hereditary madness. The room did not move. Alberta did not move. Your inheritance, he continued, would have transferred entirely to Cedric's management in the event of your committal. The estate, the accounts, everything your parents left you. She stared at the papers. 7 years. He had spent 7 years building a cage around her, and this was the lock. She returned to the library that afternoon alone. Charle had spent the morning in his study with his solicitor, the murmur of their voices traveling faintly through the walls while Alberta sat in the sitting room and looked at her hands and tried to organize the contents of her own mind into something manageable. The asylum papers had been removed from the desk. She did not know where he had put them. She understood that he was handling something, that the machinery of his influence was already moving in a direction that would eventually reach Cedric, and she found she could not think about that yet without the floor tilting slightly beneath her. So she went to the library instead. It was a long room with tall shelves that ran floor to ceiling on 3 walls, the kind of room that had been filled gradually over decades rather than assembled all at once for appearances. The books were worn and uneven. Some leaned. Some had been repaired along the spine with careful strips of cloth. A reading chair sat angled near the window with a small table beside it and a candle burned down to its last quarter, and she understood immediately that this was where Charle actually spent his time. Not the formal rooms. Here. She ran her fingers along the shelves without pulling anything down, reading spines slowly, letting the room settle around her. It was on the lowest shelf near the far window that she found it. A small volume, thinner than the rest, bound in faded blue cloth with no title on the spine. She drew it out and opened it to the first page and saw the handwriting immediately. Not printed. Written by hand, every page, in a script that was careful and even and had clearly belonged to someone who chose words the way other people chose which roads were safe to travel. For the women who stayed silent not from weakness but from wisdom, waiting for the moment the world became safe enough to speak. She stood very still. She turned the pages slowly. They were poems, she understood after the first few. Short ones mostly about endurance and seasons and the particular quality of light through a window when the outside world is too dangerous to enter. About carrying things in the body that the mouth had not yet found words for. About waiting not as surrender but as a form of strength that the impatient would always mistake for passivity. On the inside back cover, in different ink, slightly less steady, as though written later or in a harder moment, were 4 lines she read 3 times before she looked up. You are not loved in spite of what you have survived. You are loved because of what surviving made you. The woman who came through the fire hole is worth more than the woman who never knew the heat. Below it, in a child's handwriting, just 2 words. She was. Alberta closed the book carefully and held it against her chest and stood in the quiet library for a long time without moving. She heard about the newspapers from the housemaid. The girl came in early carrying the breakfast tray with her eyes slightly too wide and her movements slightly too careful, the way people move when they are carrying information they are not certain they should deliver. She set the tray down and smoothed the cloth unnecessarily and then said, without quite meeting Alberta's eyes, that there was something in the morning paper the Duke had asked her to bring up. She set it on the table beside the tray and left quickly. Alberta looked at it for a moment before picking it up. The headline was not on the front page. It was inside on the 3rd page, in the column reserved for local matters of public interest. But it was there, and it was precise, and it used Cedric's full name without hesitation. Cedric Ruhland of Ashford Estate is under formal investigation following the discovery of documents suggesting deliberate misappropriation of funds held in trust, and the fraudulent submission of medical testimony intended to facilitate the unlawful committal of a female ward. It continued for several more lines, naming the physician who had accepted payment to sign the petition, referencing the solicitor Charle had engaged, noting that the matter had been placed before the county magistrate. She read it twice. Then she set the paper down and sat with her hands flat on the table and breathed. By mid-morning the first letter arrived. Then a second. She did not read them. She gave them to Charle's housekeeper without opening them and said nothing. By early afternoon she was told that Cedric himself had appeared at the front gate on horseback, without invitation, demanding to speak with his cousin on a matter of urgent family concern. She was in the library when Charle came to find her. He stood in the doorway and looked at her steadily and said, "He is at the gate. I want you to know that you do not have to see him, today or any other day. That is entirely your decision, and I will support it completely." She looked up from the book she had not actually been reading. "What will you tell him?" "I will tell him," Charle said, with the particular quiet that she had come to understand was the most serious register of his voice, "that any further attempt to contact you by letter, by messenger, by appearance at this gate or any other entrance to this estate, will be treated as interference with an active legal matter and addressed accordingly." She was silent for a moment. "He will say I am unstable," she said. "He will say I manipulated you, that everything in those papers is true and I deceived you into marriage." Charle looked at her with an expression that did not flicker. "Let him say it," he said simply. "I know what I see when I look at you. And I know what those papers are." He held her gaze a moment longer. Then he went to the gate. It happened on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after the newspapers. She did not plan it. There was no moment of decision, no quiet resolution made the night before that the following morning would be different. She simply woke before the maid arrived and dressed herself in the pale early light, and when she reached for the shawl she had kept draped across the dressing chair every single morning since her arrival, she paused. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she left it on the chair and walked downstairs without it. The housekeeper was in the hallway when she descended, a broad and steady woman named Mrs. Holt, who had worked in the Manor for 20 years and who had never once, in 3 weeks, looked at Alberta with anything other than plain respect. Mrs. Holt glanced up from the arrangement of cut flowers she was setting in the entry table vase, took in the uncovered shoulders, and said good morning in exactly the same tone she always used. That was all. Alberta walked past her into the breakfast room and sat down and poured her own tea and felt her heart hammering as though she had done something extraordinary, when the extraordinary thing was in fact how ordinary it had been. It grew easier after that. Not all at once. Not without the occasional morning when the old habits reasserted themselves, and she reached for the shawl without thinking and put it on before she had even registered the choice. But those mornings became less frequent. The shawl stayed on the chair more often than it came with her. And nobody in the house looked at her back the way she had spent 7 years dreading. The kitchen maid nodded. The footman held doors. Mrs. Holt continued to say good morning in exactly the same tone. The world did not end. The floor did not tilt. She began to speak more at dinner. Small observations at first, the kind that required no bravery, comments about the garden or the weather or a book she had found on the lower shelf. Charle listened the way he always listened, without interruption, with his full attention directed at her as though nothing she said could be unimportant. When she disagreed with something he had said about the management of the eastern fields, she said so directly, and watched his face, and what she saw there was not anger. It was interest. Something that looked. She started finishing her sentences. She had not realized until she began doing it how many years she had spent trailing off. letting thoughts dissolve before they reached their end, because somewhere along the way she had learned that a sentence completed was a sentence that could be used against her. She finished them now. All of them. And the walls stayed standing, and the people around her simply listened and then responded, and then the conversation continued the way conversations are supposed to. One evening Charle looked at her across the dinner table and said, "There you are." She understood exactly what he meant. It was a Sunday evening in late autumn when he asked her to walk with him. The grounds of Berth Manor had turned gold and copper in the week since the scandal, the trees along the eastern path dropping their leaves in slow, unhurried layers across the gravel, and Alberta had taken to walking there in the afternoons when the light was low and amber and the air smelled of cold earth and wood smoke from the estate chimneys. It was the first place she had found outside the library where she felt entirely herself, where her shoulders stayed down without effort and her thoughts moved at their own pace without anyone requiring anything of them. Charle fell into step beside her without ceremony, his hands clasped behind his back, and they walked for a while in the comfortable silence that had become one of her favorite things about him. He had never been a man who filled quiet with noise simply to occupy it. After some time he said, "I want to show you something." He reached into his coat pocket and brought out a small ring. Not a large stone, not the kind of jewelry that announced itself from across a room. A simple band of pale gold set with a single dark blue stone, worn smooth on the inside edge from years of being worn. He held it out on his palm without moving to take her hand, without any gesture of expectation. She looked at it, then at him. "It was my mother's," he said. "Not the ring my father gave her. She bought this one herself years later, with money she had saved quietly over a long time. She wore it on her right hand." He paused. "She told me once that she kept it because it was the only thing she had chosen entirely for herself. She said that was what a ring should mean. Not a transaction. Not an arrangement made by other people in a parlor." He looked at the ring in his palm. "She said a ring should mean that you are giving someone full access to your heart. Not your name, not your household, not your social standing. Your heart, and that it should only ever be given when the choice is entirely free." Alberta stood very still on the autumn path. She thought about the church ceremony 3 months ago, the tight silence of it, the ivory dress like a cage, Cedric's hand at her back guiding her forward. The feeling of something being decided about her life in a language she had not been invited to speak. She thought about Tuesday mornings without the shawl, about finished sentences, about one evening across a dinner table when a man had looked at her and said simply, "There you are." She reached out and took the ring from his palm. She turned it once between her fingers, feeling the smooth worn gold, the weight of it, the smallness and the realness of it. Then she held out her hand. Alberta's journey reminds us that our past does not define our future. It only proves how much we can endure. Her scars were once a prison of silence, but through truth and the courage to trust again, she turned them into a story of survival. Like Alberta, you are more than the things meant to break you. You are the master of your own voice, and your truth is a strength that no one can take away. Subscribe for more stories. If Alberta's transformation from a quiet bride to a woman of choice touched your heart, hit the subscribe button to join our community. Share your thoughts. Do you believe true healing comes from within, or from the support of someone like Duke Charle? Let us know in the comments below. Like and share. If you found strength in this story of reclaiming one's voice, please give this video a thumbs up and share it with someone who needs to hear that they are not alone. Stay tuned. Don't forget to click the notification bell so you never miss a chapter of these tales of redemption and resilience.